June 6, 1944. The bocage hedgerows south of Omaha Beach. A German Panther crew sat motionless in their concealed position, watching 3 American Sherman tanks advance up the narrow country lane. The commander, a veteran of 2 years on the Eastern Front, felt the familiar confidence that came from superior armor and firepower. His 75mm gun had stopped dozens of Soviet 34s. These American tanks would be no different. Then the first Sherman fired. The impact against the Panther's frontal armor sent a shockwave through the crew compartment that no one had experienced before. The tank didn't penetrate, but the force was unlike anything they'd encountered. Within seconds, the second Sherman fired, then the third. The Panther's armor held, but something fundamental had shifted in that moment. These weren't the tanks German intelligence had described. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The story of German Panzer crews encountering American Sherman tanks in Normandy represents one of the war's most significant psychological turning points. For years, German armor doctrine had been built on a foundation of technological superiority and tactical excellence proven across Poland, France, and the vast expanses of Russia. The Panzer crews who rolled into Normandy that summer carried with them an unshakable belief in their machines and their methods. What they discovered in the hedgerows of France would challenge everything they thought they knew about armored warfare. The encounter wasn't just about metal and firepower. It was about the collision between expectation and reality, between doctrine and adaptation, between confidence and doubt. Understanding this transformation requires examining what German Panzer crews believed before D-Day. Since 1939, German armor tactics had evolved through continuous combat across multiple theaters. The early Panzer successes in Poland and France had established a reputation for invincibility that even the brutal fighting in Russia had only partially diminished. German tank commanders had faced British Matildas, French Char B-1s, and Soviet 34s. They had adapted, upgraded, and overcome each challenge. The introduction of the Tiger and Panther tanks in 1942 and 1943 seemed to cement German technological superiority permanently. These weren't just tanks. They were mobile fortresses that could destroy enemy armor at ranges where return fire was impossible. The Panther tank that entered service in mid-1943 represented the culmination of German armored development. Weighing 45 tons with frontal armor up to 80mm thick and sloped at 55 degrees, it was nearly impervious to most Allied anti-tank weapons at combat ranges. The long 75mm KUK-42 gun could penetrate 140mm of armor at 1,000 meters. German crews who transitioned to Panthers from earlier models felt they had graduated to an entirely different class of weapon. The view through the gunner's sight, the smooth traverse of the turret, the confident knowledge that enemy shells would bounce off the glacis plate, all of this created a psychological advantage as important as the technical specifications. Tiger crews possessed even greater confidence. The 56-ton Tiger I, with its 88mm gun, had achieved legendary status on all fronts. Reports from North Africa, Sicily, and Russia told of single Tigers destroying entire columns of enemy armor. The famous engagement at Villers Bocage in June 1944, where SS Obersturmführer Michael Whitman destroyed 25 British vehicles in 15 minutes, would only confirm what Tiger crews already believed. Their tank was the most powerful armored fighting vehicle in the world. This wasn't arrogance. It was rational confidence based on combat experience and technical reality. German intelligence assessments of American armor reinforced this confidence. Reports from Tunisia and Italy described the M4 Sherman as adequate but unremarkable. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun could penetrate approximately 60mm of armor at 500 meters, sufficient against Panzer IIIs and IVs, but inadequate against Panthers and Tigers. The Sherman's armor protection maxed out at 76mm on the frontal hull, substantially less than German heavy tanks. German tactical documents from early 1944 categorized the Sherman as equivalent to the Panzer IV, a tank now considered obsolescent by Panzer divisions equipped with Panthers and Tigers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. What German intelligence failed to fully appreciate was the American approach to armored warfare. While German doctrine emphasized individual tank superiority and the decisive engagement, American doctrine prioritized coordination, logistics, and overwhelming numbers. The Sherman wasn't designed to win one-on-one duels with Panthers. It was designed to be produced in massive quantities, maintained easily in field conditions, and operated effectively by crews with limited training time. These weren't weaknesses. They were deliberate design choices reflecting fundamentally different military philosophies. The first encounters in Normandy should have been straightforward demonstrations of German superiority. Panzer Lehr Division, one of the Wehrmacht's elite armoured units, deployed into the bocage with full confidence in their equipment and training. The division included dozens of Panthers and Panzer IVs manned by experienced crews, many veterans of the Krutic, Eastern Front. They understood hedgerow fighting. They knew how to use terrain for concealment and how to establish killing zones along the narrow lanes. When American armor began pushing inland from the beaches, German commanders expected to inflict devastating losses using tactics proven in Russia. The reality proved far more complex. Yes, German tanks possessed superior armor and firepower in direct engagement. A Panther could destroy a Sherman at 1,500 meters. A Sherman needed to close to within 500 meters to have any chance of penetrating a Panther's frontal armor. In theory, this range advantage should have made German victory inevitable, but the bocage terrain eliminated long-range engagements. The hedgerows, some dating back to Roman times, created a maze of small fields surrounded by earthen banks topped with thick vegetation. Visibility rarely exceeded 100 meters. The range advantage that made Panthers and Tigers dominant in Russia became irrelevant in Normandy. American tactics adapted to this reality faster than German doctrine could accommodate. Sherman platoons advanced with infantry support, using combined arms coordination that German units had abandoned in favor of pure armor tactics. American tank destroyers, particularly the M10 and M18 with their superior mobility, used the hedgerow maze to their advantage, engaging from unexpected angles and withdrawing before German tanks could respond. Most significantly, American artillery support proved overwhelming. German Panzer crews discovered that revealing their position by firing often resulted in immediate and devastating artillery bombardment. The psychological impact of these encounters accumulated gradually. A Panther crew might win an engagement, destroying 2 or 3 Shermans before withdrawing. But the destroyed Shermans would be replaced within hours. The same intersection that had been cleared in the morning would have new American tanks by afternoon. German crews began experiencing something they'd never felt on the Eastern Front: numerical inevitability. Soviet armor had been numerous, but Soviet tactics had often been predictable and Soviet coordination poor. American armor arrived in endless numbers, backed by perfect coordination and seemingly unlimited artillery support. The Battle of Villers Bocage on June 13, 1944, illustrated both German capabilities and emerging limitations. Michael Whitman's famous attack destroyed a British armoured column, but the broader battle revealed how British forces adapted. Within hours, British tanks and anti-tank guns had destroyed Whitman's supporting Tigers and forced the survivors to withdraw. The action demonstrated that even the mighty Tiger could be overwhelmed when faced with coordinated opposition and numerical superiority. For German crews, the lesson was sobering. Individual superiority meant nothing against systematic combined arms tactics. Technical problems compounded psychological pressures. The Panther, for all its impressive specifications, suffered from chronic mechanical unreliability. Final drive failures plagued the design, often immobilizing tanks after relatively short distances. In the fluid combat of the Eastern Front, damaged Panthers could be recovered and repaired. In Normandy, surrounded by enemy forces and under constant artillery fire, a mechanical breakdown often meant permanent loss. Crews began to recognize that their superior tank was also a maintenance liability that couldn't be sustained under campaign conditions. The Sherman's mechanical reliability became a psychological weapon. German crews observed American tanks operating continuously for days without apparent maintenance. Shermans that were knocked out and abandoned in the morning would be recovered, repaired, and back in action by evening. The American maintenance and supply system seemed almost supernatural in its efficiency. German mechanics working on damaged Panthers with inadequate spare parts and limited workshop facilities couldn't compete. The knowledge that American tanks would return while German tanks might never be repaired eroded confidence in ways that tactical victories couldn't restore. Tiger crews faced different but equally challenging realities. The Tiger's weight and fuel consumption limited its operational range. In Russia, Tigers had operated from secure bases with established supply lines. In Normandy, constant Allied air attacks made daylight movement suicidal and severed supply lines. Tigers that could theoretically dominate any battlefield found themselves immobilized by lack of fuel or unable to move because bridges couldn't support their weight. The psychological shift from feeling invincible to feeling trapped proved devastating for crew morale. German commanders recognized these problems but lacked solutions. Reorganizing Panzer divisions to emphasize combined arms coordination required time and resources that weren't available. Improving logistics under constant air attack was impossible. Replacing destroyed Panthers and Tigers couldn't be done. German production totaled fewer than 6,000 Panthers and only about 1,300 Tigers throughout the entire war. Meanwhile, American production exceeded 49,000 Shermans. The mathematics of attrition were inescapable, and German Panzer crews could do that arithmetic. The encounters with Sherman tanks, equipped with the 76mm gun, added a new dimension of uncertainty. Starting in July 1944, some American tank battalions received Shermans with the higher-velocity 76mm M1 gun, capable of penetrating 109mm of armor at 500 meters. This was sufficient to defeat Panther side armor and even frontal armor under favorable conditions. German crews could no longer assume that every Sherman was harmless. Each encounter required instant assessment of which Sherman variant they faced, and mistakes proved fatal. The psychological transformation among German Panzer crews wasn't about fear. These were professional soldiers with extensive combat experience. Rather, it was about the erosion of certainty. On the Eastern Front, a German tank commander knew his Panther could defeat any Soviet tank in single combat. In Normandy, survival depended on factors beyond the tank itself: artillery support that didn't arrive, mechanical reliability that couldn't be guaranteed, numerical superiority that didn't exist, and tactical situations where individual tank superiority became irrelevant. Confidence required certainty, and certainty was precisely what the Normandy campaign destroyed. Veterans of both Eastern and Western fronts noted the difference in their memoirs. In Russia, battles were decided by tactical skill, technical superiority, and operational audacity. In France, battles were decided by logistics, artillery coordination, and numerical advantage. German Panzer tactics had been developed for the former type of warfare. They proved inadequate for the latter. The crews who survived Normandy learned to respect American armor, not because Shermans were superior tanks, but because they represented a form of warfare that German doctrine couldn't counter. The battle for Caen throughout June and July 1944 demonstrated these dynamics repeatedly. German Panzer divisions defending the city destroyed hundreds of British and Canadian tanks, but the Allies simply brought up more tanks, more artillery, and more infantry. Each German success was tactical. Each Allied failure was temporary. German crews began to understand that they were fighting a different kind of war, one where their technical advantages couldn't overcome systematic disadvantages in numbers, logistics, and artillery support. By late July 1944, the psychological transformation was complete. German Panzer crews still believed in their tanks' technical superiority. They still executed their tactical doctrine with professional skill, but they no longer believed they could win. The endless columns of Sherman tanks, the overwhelming artillery, the perfect Allied air superiority, and the knowledge that every loss was permanent, while American losses were temporary, all combined to create a sense of inevitable defeat. This wasn't demoralization, it was rational assessment of military reality by experienced combat soldiers. The transformation of German Panzer crew psychology manifested most clearly in the tactical adaptations that emerged during August 1944. As Operation Cobra shattered German defensive lines and American armor poured through the Avranches Gap, Panzer units found themselves engaged in mobile warfare, theoretically their preferred operating environment. Yet the conditions bore little resemblance to the sweeping offensives of 1940 and 1941. German commanders discovered that mobility without fuel, maneuver without air cover, and offensive action without numerical superiority produced only chaos and casualties. The Panthers and Tigers that should have dominated open terrain instead became isolated targets for Allied fighter bombers and vulnerable to encirclement by faster-moving Sherman formations. The Falaise Pocket in mid-August crystallized every nightmare that German Panzer crews had developed over the previous 2 months. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers found themselves trapped in a shrinking perimeter, subjected to constant artillery bombardment and air attack, while Allied armor closed from multiple directions. Panzer units attempting to break through encountered Sherman formations that simply refused to yield. German crews would destroy lead American tanks, only to face immediate replacement vehicles. The Americans seemed to possess unlimited tanks, unlimited ammunition, and unlimited willingness to absorb casualties. 4. German crews accustomed to enemies who withdrew after heavy losses, this relentless pressure proved psychologically devastating. Individual accounts from German Panzer crews reveal the depth of this psychological shift. A Panther commander from 2nd Panzer Division recorded in his diary that his crew had destroyed 11 Sherman tanks over 4 days of fighting near Mortain. Under any reasonable military calculation, such success should have earned his unit tactical breathing space. Instead, American pressure increased. The same roads his Panther had defended were attacked by fresh Sherman platoons the next morning. The destroyed American tanks had been cleared away overnight, creating no obstacle to renewed assault. His own Panther, meanwhile, was down to 40 shells, had a damaged final drive, and couldn't be resupplied because Allied aircraft controlled every road. Technical superiority meant nothing when the superior tank couldn't move, couldn't be resupplied, and faced endless waves of inferior but operational enemy vehicles. The German doctrine of quality over quantity had worked when quality could be sustained and quantity remained manageable. Normandy inverted both conditions. Panther and Tiger mechanical failures reached crisis levels under sustained combat operations. The final drive problems that had plagued Panthers since their introduction at Kursk in 1943 became catastrophic in Normandy's demanding terrain. Crews reported final drive failures after as little as 150 kilometers of operation. Tiger crews faced similar challenges with their complex interleaved road wheel system, which became clogged with mud and debris, sometimes freezing overnight and requiring hours of maintenance before the tank could move. These weren't minor inconveniences. They were operational failures that transformed superior tanks into immobile pillboxes. American maintenance capabilities added another layer of psychological pressure. German crews observed Sherman tanks being recovered under fire, often by dedicated tank recovery vehicles that German forces lacked. American maintenance units operated with industrial efficiency, performing repairs that would take German mechanics days in field workshops that didn't exist. A Sherman knocked out in morning combat might return to battle that afternoon with fresh paint over the repaired damage. Panthers destroyed by mechanical failure often sat abandoned because recovery vehicles couldn't reach them or lacked capacity to move 45-ton tanks under combat conditions. The contrast wasn't lost on German crews, who understood that their technical advantages were being systematically negated by superior logistics. The introduction of American tank destroyers created additional uncertainty that German crews found deeply unsettling. The M10 Wolverine with its 3-inch gun and the M18 Hellcat with its 76mm gun possessed penetration capabilities that rivaled German anti-tank guns. More significantly, they employed tactics that exploited their superior mobility and lower profile. German Panther crews trained to engage enemy tanks in direct combat found themselves ambushed by tank destroyers that appeared from unexpected positions, fired quickly, and withdrew before German tanks could respond effectively. The psychological impact of facing enemies who refused to fight according to German tactical expectations proved as significant as the physical damage the tank destroyers inflicted. Allied air superiority transformed daytime operations into suicide missions for German armor. Panzer crews who had operated freely in Poland, France, and even Russia now found themselves confined to movement during darkness or under heavy weather. The American P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bomber, equipped with rockets and bombs, could destroy even Tigers with direct hits. More importantly, Allied aircraft served as aerial reconnaissance, identifying German armor concentrations and directing artillery fire with devastating accuracy. German crews developed paranoid awareness of the sky, understanding that any movement during daylight hours invited immediate air attack. This constant threat didn't just limit tactical options, it fundamentally altered how crews perceived their own vulnerability. The effectiveness of American artillery coordination particularly shocked German veterans of the Eastern Front. Soviet artillery had been plentiful, but often poorly coordinated. American artillery appeared instantly whenever German forces revealed their positions. Forward observers, often operating with Sherman tanks, could call down battalion-level fire missions within minutes. German Panther crews learned that firing their main gun, despite its superior range and accuracy, often provoked artillery bombardment that forced withdrawal regardless of tactical success. The psychological calculus changed fundamentally. Superior firepower became liability rather than advantage when using that firepower invited overwhelming response. German tactical doctrine had emphasized the decisive engagement the moment when superior German tanks would destroy inferior enemy armor and break enemy morale. Normandy demonstrated that American forces didn't break. Sherman units that suffered 70% casualties would reorganize and return to combat with replacement tanks and crews within 24 hours. German units that suffered similar losses often ceased to exist as effective fighting formations because replacements didn't arrive. The Americans appeared to possess unlimited capacity to absorb punishment and continue attacking. For German crews, this created an existential crisis. Victory in individual engagements meant nothing if the enemy simply continued attacking with fresh forces. The Battle of Aracourt in September 1944 provided perhaps the clearest demonstration of how American tactical adaptation had neutralized German armor advantages. German forces, including Panthers from the 5th Panzer Army, attacked American positions held by the 4th Armored Division, equipped with Sherman tanks. The Germans should have won based on equipment superiority. Instead, American forces destroyed approximately 280 German tanks, while losing fewer than 40 Shermans. German after-action reports struggled to explain how technically inferior American tanks had achieved such devastating results. The reality was that American forces had adapted their tactics specifically to counter German armor, using terrain, combined arms coordination, and superior battlefield intelligence to offset equipment disadvantages. German crews began exhibiting symptoms of what would later be recognized as combat fatigue, though the term didn't exist in Wehrmacht vocabulary. Commanders reported increasing instances of crews abandoning operational tanks after minor damage, claiming mechanical failure that maintenance inspection couldn't verify. Other crews became excessively cautious, refusing to advance into situations where Panther capabilities should have guaranteed success. These weren't cowards, many had iron crosses and years of combat experience. Rather, they were rational soldiers who had calculated that survival required avoiding risks that doctrine demanded they take. The confidence that had sustained German armor through years of war had been replaced by grim awareness that individual skill and technical superiority couldn't overcome systemic disadvantages. The impact on German tactical planning became evident in late summer 1944. Panzer divisions that previously executed aggressive mobile operations now focused on defensive positions and controlled withdrawals. Commanders who had built careers on offensive audacity began planning operations around conservation of forces rather than destruction of enemy units. Hitler's frequent orders for counterattacks were executed half-heartedly when executed at all, because Panzer commanders understood that throwing their remaining tanks against prepared American positions guaranteed losses they couldn't replace. This represented fundamental transformation of German armor doctrine, driven by psychological recognition that previous methods no longer worked. The declining quality of German replacement crews compounded these psychological pressures. Early war Panzer crews had received extensive training, often 6 months or more before entering combat. By late 1944, replacement crews arrived at the front with as little as 4 weeks' training. Veterans watched these inexperienced crews make basic mistakes that got them killed within days. The presence of poorly trained replacements reminded experienced crews that Germany's human resources were as exhausted as its material resources. Even if Panthers and Tigers remained technically superior, the crews operating them no longer possessed skill levels that had made early war Panzer forces so effective. German intelligence assessments evolved to reflect battlefield realities. Reports from late 1944 acknowledged that American armor tactics had progressed significantly since Tunisia. American tank crews now understood how to exploit Sherman advantages, reliability, mobility, and numbers, while minimizing exposure to German firepower. American combined arms coordination had reached levels that German forces couldn't match, given their depleted infantry and artillery resources. Most significantly, intelligence officers recognized that American willingness to accept casualties and continue attacking represented psychological advantage that German forces lacked. Americans believed they would win. Germans increasingly recognized they would lose. The introduction of the Sherman Firefly in British and Canadian units added another dimension to German crew anxiety. The Firefly mounted a 17-pound gun capable of penetrating Panther frontal armor at 1,000 meters, the first Allied tank that could reliably defeat German heavy armor at combat ranges. German crews could no longer distinguish Fireflies from standard Shermans at distance, meaning every encounter with Allied armor carried risk that didn't exist earlier in the campaign. This uncertainty eroded the confidence that came from knowing German tanks were superior. Now they were only sometimes superior, and crews couldn't determine which encounters would prove deadly until shells were already flying. The psychological burden of fighting a defensive campaign proved particularly heavy for crews trained in offensive doctrine. German Panzer tactics emphasized maneuver warfare, aggressive exploitation of breakthroughs, and decisive engagement against enemy weaknesses. Normandy forced German armor into static defense of prepared positions, reactive responses to American initiatives, and gradual withdrawal under constant pressure. Crews found themselves executing missions their training had barely addressed, using tanks designed for offensive operations in defensive roles that negated their key advantages. The resulting cognitive dissonance, knowing their tanks were superior while recognizing they were losing, created psychological stress that affected crew effectiveness. Veterans' memoirs from this period reveal consistent themes: frustration at mechanical unreliability, anger at absent air support, resignation about numerical inferiority, and bitter recognition that German tactical excellence couldn't overcome systemic disadvantages. These weren't excuses or rationalizations. They were accurate assessments by professional soldiers of a military situation that had become untenable. The confidence of June had transformed into grim determination by August and fatalistic acceptance by September. German Panzer crews continued fighting because discipline, professionalism, and unit cohesion remained strong, not because they believed victory was possible. The September 1944 Market Garden operation demonstrated that German armored forces retained tactical competence even as strategic situation deteriorated. Panzer units helped defeat British airborne forces at Arnhem through skillful use of available armour and aggressive infantry armour coordination. But even this tactical success reinforced broader strategic reality. German forces won because British forces were isolated, outnumbered, and lacked artillery support conditions that rarely occurred in normal operations. When German armor faced Allied forces with full combined arms support, outcomes consistently favored the Allies, regardless of German tactical skill or equipment superiority. The impact of constant combat without adequate rest or refit took psychological toll that's difficult to quantify, but easy to observe in historical records. Panzer crews in Russia typically received periodic rotation to rear areas for rest, maintenance, and training integration with replacement crews. In France, operational demands prevented such rotation. Crews remained in combat continuously, sleeping in their tanks, eating cold rations, and maintaining their vehicles under fire. The accumulated stress of months without respite affected decision-making, morale, and combat effectiveness in ways that training and experience couldn't overcome. Exhausted crews made mistakes that fresh crews wouldn't make, and German forces lacked the depth of reserves to provide the relief that sustained combat operations required. By October 1944, as Allied forces approached German borders, Panzer crew psychology had completed its transformation. The men who had entered Normandy, confident in their tanks' superiority and their own tactical excellence, had learned painful lessons about modern industrialized warfare. Technical superiority meant nothing without logistical support to sustain it. Tactical excellence couldn't overcome numerical inferiority. Individual crew skill was irrelevant when systematic advantages lay with the enemy. These weren't failures of courage or competence. They were recognitions of military reality by soldiers who had experienced that reality in its most brutal form. The confidence that had sustained German armor through 5 years of war had been broken not by superior enemy tanks, but by superior enemy systems. The final months of 1944 brought German Panzer crews face to face with a reality more psychologically devastating than tactical defeat, the recognition that their enemy had become better at armored warfare than they were. This wasn't about individual tank specifications or crew training levels. It was about systematic excellence in every aspect of mechanized combat logistics, maintenance, combined arms coordination, intelligence gathering, and operational planning. German crews, who had spent years believing themselves the masters of armored warfare, now confronted American forces who had learned, adapted, and surpassed German methods through industrial-scale application of resources and ruthless operational efficiency. The Allied advance into the Low Countries and toward the German frontier in autumn 1944 revealed the full extent of German armor's decline. Panzer divisions that had numbered over 200 tanks in June now fielded 30 or 40 operational vehicles. These weren't primarily combat losses, though those were substantial. More significantly, mechanical attrition had consumed German armor faster than combat ever could. Panthers abandoned due to final drive failure, Tigers immobilized by transmission problems, and tanks of all types left behind during retreats because fuel shortages prevented their movement. These losses exceeded those from direct combat. American Sherman formations, meanwhile, maintained operational readiness rates exceeding 80% through systematic maintenance and unlimited spare parts availability. The psychological impact of this disparity manifested in unexpected ways. German crews began viewing their technically superior tanks as liabilities rather than advantages. A Panther's superior armor and firepower meant nothing if the tank broke down 50 kilometers from the front and couldn't be recovered. Crews increasingly preferred older Panzer IV tanks despite their inferior specifications, because Panzer IVs were mechanically reliable and could be repaired with available spare parts. This preference for proven reliability over theoretical superiority represented fundamental reversal of German armor philosophy. The Wehrmacht had built its doctrine on qualitative superiority. Now experienced crews were rejecting that superiority because it couldn't be sustained under operational conditions. The Battle of Aachen in October 1944 demonstrated how completely American forces had mastered urban armor combat. German defensive doctrine called for panzer units to counterattack American penetrations using superior armor to restore defensive lines. American forces simply absorbed these counterattacks, destroyed the attacking Panthers and Tigers through coordinated anti-tank defenses, and continued their methodical reduction of German positions. German crews discovered that American infantry now carried bazookas in numbers that made any armored operation in urban terrain suicidal. The same weapon Germans had reverse-engineered and improved as the Panzer was now being used against them with devastating effectiveness by American infantry who seemed to possess unlimited ammunition. The Hürtgen Forest battles from September through November 1944 imposed conditions where German armor advantages became completely irrelevant. Dense forest prevented effective use of long-range gunnery. Narrow trails limited maneuver to single-file movement. Constant artillery bombardment and air attack made any armored movement catastrophically dangerous. German Panther crews found themselves unable to employ their tanks' capabilities in terrain where American forces held every advantage. The forest fighting proved that American doctrine had evolved beyond simply countering German armor. American forces now dictated combat conditions that made German armor irrelevant. This represented complete reversal of the tactical dynamic that had characterized early war armored operations. German attempts to restore Panzer effectiveness through new equipment revealed how far German armor had fallen behind American operational capabilities. The Panther OS-4G model, introduced in March 1944, featured improvements addressing earlier reliability problems. The modifications came too late and in insufficient numbers to matter operationally. Production totaled approximately 3,000 units before war's end, and chronic final drive problems persisted despite engineering efforts. Meanwhile, American Sherman production continued at scale that made individual German improvements irrelevant. Americans could afford to lose 3 Shermans for every Panther destroyed and still achieve favorable exchange rates because Sherman losses were replaced within days, while Panther losses were permanent. The December 1944 Ardennes offensive, popularly known as the Battle of the Bulge, represented Germany's final attempt to employ Panzer forces in their intended offensive role. The operations planning revealed how disconnected German high command had become from battlefield realities that Panzer crews understood intimately. The offensive required German armor to advance rapidly through difficult terrain in winter conditions, capture American fuel depots because German logistics couldn't supply adequate fuel, achieve breakthrough before American reinforcements arrived, and do all this without air support while American air forces dominated the skies. Every assumption underlying the operation contradicted everything German Panzer crews had learned in 6 months of combat against American forces. The Ardennes fighting proved even more psychologically devastating than Normandy because it demonstrated German armor's decline under optimal conditions. The offensive began with surprise, favorable weather that grounded Allied aircraft, and German forces attacking thinly held American positions. Despite these advantages, American forces contained the German advance within days and began systematic destruction of Panzer formations within 2 weeks. German crews discovered that even when conditions favored German operations, American forces adapted faster, mobilized reserves more effectively, and coordinated combined arms responses that German forces couldn't match. The failure of the Ardennes offensive under near-ideal conditions destroyed any remaining illusions about German armor's capabilities relative to American forces. Individual German Panzer commanders' accounts from the Ardennes reveal universal themes: frustration at fuel shortages that immobilized entire columns, shock at the speed of American reinforcement and counterattack, dismay at seeing Tiger tanks abandoned after minor damage because recovery was impossible, and bitter recognition that German tactical victories were operationally meaningless. A Panther battalion commander recorded destroying 17 American tanks on December 17, 1944, only to face 35 fresh American tanks the following morning. His own battalion, having started the offensive with 48 Panthers, was down to 11 operational tanks, not primarily from combat losses, but from mechanical failures and fuel exhaustion. The mathematics of attrition had become undeniable even to the most dedicated professional soldiers. The psychological burden of operating King Tiger tanks during the Ardennes offensive exemplified the disconnect between German equipment capabilities and operational realities. The King Tiger, mounting an 88mm KJOK 43 gun and protected by 180mm of frontal armor, represented the ultimate expression of German armor philosophy. No Allied tank could penetrate its armor at combat ranges. Its gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Yet King Tigers proved operationally useless in the Ardennes. Their 68-ton weight exceeded bridge capacity for most crossings, forcing long detours. Fuel consumption of approximately 2 liters per kilometer meant they ran out of fuel within hours of starting operations. Mechanical complexity resulted in breakdown rates exceeding 50% during the offensive. Crews commanding the most powerful tanks ever built found themselves repeatedly abandoning these technological marvels because they couldn't be supplied, couldn't cross bridges, and couldn't be recovered when they broke down. American tank crews' evolution during this period mirrored and exceeded German decline. Sherman commanders who had been tentative and cautious in Normandy were now aggressive and confident. American crews had learned that coordinated platoon attacks overwhelmed individual German tanks regardless of specifications. They understood that German tanks had to be destroyed quickly because prolonged engagement invited German artillery response, but they also knew that German artillery response was now rarely effective due to ammunition shortages and counter-battery fire. Most significantly, American crews recognized that German armor was dying from internal causes as much as from American fire. Waiting for German tanks to suffer mechanical failure or fuel exhaustion proved as effective as direct engagement and considerably safer. The final collapse of German armor effectiveness came not in dramatic battle but through gradual exhaustion of every resource required to sustain mechanized warfare. By January 1945, German Panzer divisions existed primarily on paper. Units with proud histories and extensive combat records fielded 10 or 15 tanks when establishment called for hundreds. Crews with years of experience couldn't operate because their tanks sat immobilized for lack of fuel. Maintenance personnel couldn't repair vehicles because spare parts didn't exist. Training facilities couldn't produce qualified replacement crews because training time had been cut to weeks, and fuel for training exercises wasn't available. The systematic collapse of German military-industrial capacity manifested most clearly in the Panzer forces, which required the most complex logistical support of any German combat units. The psychological impact on surviving German Panzer crews transcended simple demoralization. These were soldiers who had witnessed the complete inversion of military realities they had relied upon throughout their careers. They had entered the war with superior equipment, superior training, and superior doctrine. They had maintained that superiority through years of combat across multiple theaters. Then, in less than 1 year, they had watched American forces systematically dismantle every German advantage through application of industrial resources, tactical adaptation, and operational excellence that German forces couldn't match. This wasn't defeat through enemy brilliance or German mistakes. It was defeat through systematic superiority across every aspect of modern warfare. The memoirs and interviews with German Panzer veterans from the post-war period reveal consistent recognition of what had occurred. American forces hadn't won by building better tanks. The Sherman remained inferior to the Panther in most technical specifications throughout the war. Americans had won by building sustainable systems that maintained operational effectiveness regardless of tactical outcomes. German crews could win 10 engagements and lose the 11th, and that loss would be permanent because replacement tanks, crews, and supplies didn't exist. American crews could lose 10 engagements and win the 11th, and that victory would be decisive because they possessed unlimited capacity to absorb losses and continue operations. The final weeks of the war saw German Panzer crews fighting without illusions or expectations. They defended because discipline demanded it, because loyalty to comrades required it, and because no alternative existed. But they harbored no beliefs about ultimate victory or even temporary success. They had witnessed the complete triumph of American industrial warfare over German military excellence. The confidence that had sustained them through years of war had been systematically destroyed through encounters with an enemy who proved superior not in courage or tactical skill, but in every systematic aspect of modern warfare that mattered. The historical significance of this psychological transformation extends beyond World War II. The German Panzer experience in Normandy and subsequent Western Front campaigns demonstrated that technological superiority alone cannot guarantee military success. Sustainability, logistics, operational depth, and systematic excellence matter more than individual platform performance. Modern military planners study the German armour decline as cautionary tale about mistaking tactical quality for strategic capability. German Panther and Tiger tanks remained technically superior to American Shermans throughout the war. Yet American armour forces achieved complete operational victory through systematic advantages that overwhelmed German technical excellence. The human dimension of this story deserves recognition beyond tactical analysis. German panzer crews were professional soldiers executing their duty under increasingly impossible conditions. They weren't responsible for the criminal regime they served, or the genocidal war that regime prosecuted, but they experienced directly the ultimate futility of military excellence, unsupported by adequate resources, realistic strategy, or sustainable logistics. Their psychological journey from confidence to recognition of defeat provides insights into how military forces cope with systematic disadvantages that cannot be overcome through individual courage or tactical skill. The encounters between German panzer crews and American Sherman formations in Normandy and beyond represented collision between two fundamentally different approaches to modern warfare. Germans emphasized individual excellence, technical superiority, and decisive tactical engagement. Americans emphasized systematic coordination, logistical sustainability, and overwhelming operational capacity. History's verdict proved unambiguous. The American approach prevailed completely, not through superior courage or even superior tactics, but through superior understanding of what modern industrialized warfare required. German panzer crews learned this lesson at terrible cost, experiencing firsthand the transformation from confident superiority to recognition of inevitable defeat. Their story stands as permanent reminder that in modern warfare, systematic excellence matters more than individual superiority, and sustainability trumps temporary tactical advantage. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.